Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And today on the ITPro Podcast, we were going to be talking about the outcome of the US election and what that means for tech. But as the results are still coming in at the time we're recording this, which is Thursday afternoon, we're instead taking a look at one of the biggest names in PC gaming, Nvidia.
Now, if you're familiar with Nvidia's PC graphics cards, you might be a little bit confused about why a business technology podcast is talking about them. But Nvidia actually does a lot more than just gaming technology. In fact, in many ways, gaming is just a side hustle. Its real work is much more technical than that.
So, Nvidia was founded in 1993, which was the same year that you were founded, Adam. By Jensen Huang, formerly of LSI Logic and AMD, and two Sun Microsystems engineers, Chris Malachowski and Curtis Priam.
Now, they founded Nvidia, they were all chip designers and engineers, and they founded Nvidia because they saw the potential in GPU technology and graphics processing chips in general. Now, they didn't originally found it as specifically a gaming company. What they did was they looked at the potential for GPU technology in computing applications and in solving problems that traditional computing couldn't, as well as looking at the time, current rise of gaming, PC gaming particularly, as an industry. They saw that it was on a huge growth curve, and they looked at it and they said, right, we can use GPU technology in gaming to finance our research and development into other GPU applications for things like science and health and high-performance computing, that kind of thing. So it's always had a real focus on R&D and computational problems right from the get-go.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty canny business strategy, really. I'm sure that I am not the only person who, when reading the word Nvidia, immediately hears the Nvidia of the startup for most, but not all, PC games, as probably a testament to how much time I have spent in front of a PC gaming. But yes, like I say, it's quite a canny business move to use something that is clearly a growth market, can bring in a lot of money, while then reinvesting that to focus on the area that where you really see the strengths, if you get what I mean.
So without getting too deep into the technical and engineering side of things, GPUs are particularly suited to certain kinds of problems due to the way they're designed and the way they work. So they're very good at parallel processing, which enables them to tackle challenges that traditional CPUs and traditional kind of general purpose computing kind of struggles with a little bit. So simulation models and obviously visual things, so image recognition, image processing, hence why they're so good at, rendering video games. That also applies to a lot of scientific and research and graphic design applications that traditional CPUs have kind of historically struggled with.
Yeah, I think the way that I quite often think of them is that the CPU does effectively quite basic calculations. It is the calculator part of a computer or of a system, whereas GPUs can do stuff that's slightly more conceptual, that as a human you would use your visual brain to think about, and that's what it's conjuring for you, is these visual models. So that's the way I see it. That's why it's used so much in high performance computing, which, it's funny when you hear the word supercomputer and you just think, wow, a supercomputer. But that's, as I have grown into this job, you realize that is more what it's used for, is this kind of quite often conceptual processing. I think is a fair kind of assessment of the situation and the difference between the two of them. Speaking of sort of visual representations, Nvidia's company colour is green, which I believe sort of plays into the origin of its name.
The name comes from the fact that the founders used the letters NV on all of their files and documents, signifying next version. And when the time came to incorporate, they looked at all of the names that they could choose, which prominently featured the letters NV, and settled on Nvidia, with an I, naturally, but they lopped that off, which is Latin for envy. So potentially that is the history of the green colour scheme, which has now become pretty synonymous, I'd say, within kind of PC and computing culture. And I think it's quite notable how synonymous Nvidia has become with PC gaming in particular. You know, it's only been around for just under 30 years, but it feels like it's been around for, forever, basically.
Yeah. I mean, when you were saying up top that it was founded in 1993, and I do always feel that feels so young. I appreciate that, like, one of those things that happens as you get older is that things that seem really recent were actually several decades ago.
In my head, the 70s will always be 30 years ago, and it is slightly unsettling to think that, no, that's actually the 90s.
Yeah, but, it feels as embedded as, Intel or Microsoft or, maybe not quite IBM, but it's surprising that it only came into being in 1993. Now I have to say I find it quite funny that it was all their files are called next version, because it gets into a kind of like final draft, final draft, final draft for approval type thing that you see in business documents. This is what collaboration software is all to kind of overcome, allegedly. So if only Jensen and gang had Google Docs or something back in 1993, they would have had to have found another name. And yes, with losing the I on the front of Nvidia, it demonstrates once again that the 1990s was not a kind time for vowels.
I mean, arguably still isn't. The amount of startups that have just no vowels whatsoever. So pretty much since Nvidia launched, it's been at the forefront of PC and PC hardware, but it's always had a strong focus on the research and development side, which you can see through its history of acquisitions. It's been very, very aggressive over the course of its history about snapping up smaller companies. And it's done that with a focus largely on technology and tools rather than just products and hardware.
Yeah, some of the most notable of these is the HPC compiler firm PGI, Mellanox, and ARM, most recently and perhaps most controversially.
Yeah, and all of these are companies which Nvidia isn't necessarily buying for the strength of its product portfolio in the same way that, Dell did when it bought EMC, but they're bought for the expertise and the behind-the-scenes development tools that they have, and all of that is getting funneled into Nvidia's research and development strategy and pipeline, which is arguably one of the reasons why it is so cutting edge in terms of the technology that it's bringing to the market.
Yeah, and there do seem to be sort of two strategies for businesses when they're making acquisitions. Some focus hard on, like you say, acquiring the products. Dell is a good example.
As is VMware, come to think about it.
Yeah, Dell is a good example. VMware is, HP to an extent, but others, like Nvidia has done, are actually going after not just like the intellectual property, but like just the intellect that is in the business, and you're going after the expertise. So yeah, that's very much kind of their whole strategy for what companies they've targeted for acquisition has been about getting specialisms, getting just kind of knowledge and that kind of thing, as well as any hardware that might come along with that, which very much the case with ARM.
And you can see this in GTC, which is Nvidia's annual technology conference. It stands for literally GPU Technology Conference, and that's run every year in California, obviously virtually this year, but it focuses much more these days on applications like artificial intelligence, deep learning, self-driving cars, high-performance computing, some medical stuff. It's where Jensen always pulls the new flagship Geforce graphics card out of the oven, which he's done for many, many years in a rather
be
adorable.
My favourite gimmick. Like,
it's so good, isn't it?
There are so many gimmicks in this industry, but pulling a freshly baked Geforce out of an oven is just, I love it. I love it. I can't, it's just don't, Jensen, if you're listening to this podcast, which I'm sure you are, keep pulling the graphics cards from your oven. It's brilliant. I love it.
Jensen for Bake Off 2021. But despite the fact that this conference is where the next generation of GeForce is always removed from the oven by Jensen, it's not actually the focus of the majority of the conference. The vast majority of what is discussed and demonstrated and shown off at GTC is this kind of really quite hardcore AI, machine learning, self-driving cars, applications, real cutting edge, hard science R&D kind of stuff. It's not just graphics and processors and, shiny games.
I think even people who are really into it, which, I am probably slightly less than you are, would probably die of boredom if it was just that.
Well, on that note, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll be talking about where, aside from gaming, Nvidia actually makes its money.
See you after the break.
Welcome back. Now, as we were discussing before the break, gaming may be what Nvidia is best known for, but it's actually not the majority of its business. The majority of its products actually aren't focused on gaming. Aside from the GeForce graphics cards and its range of Nvidia Shield first-party gaming devices, the rest of its ranges are focused on other stuff aside from the games industry.
Yes, so notably it produces the Quadro graphics cards, which are used in professional editing, in rendering workstations. They're used by VFX artists, modelers, so on and so forth, and self-driving car solutions, which that one may seem like a bit of an outlier, but when you think about what self-driving car software and hardware does, is it's acting as like artificial eyes.
It's image recognition on a massive scale.
Yeah. So like I say, it may seem like an outlier, but actually when you think about it a bit, it's a perfectly natural place for it to be.
Yeah, like we were saying, GPUs are amazing at image recognition, and when you are processing kind of live input data in the way that a self-driving car needs to in order to recognize, a little child running out into the road, you need something that is capable of split-second image analysis and verification, which is why GPUs are so widely used.
Yes, sadly, a GPU presumably has better spatial awareness than I do, which is why a robot might have a driving license and I do not. I feel like I should clarify, I didn't run over any small children. They gave me, they failed me before I was able to do that.
It's probably a good thing for all of us that you're not on the roads. So, Nvidia also has a major cloud business. It supplies all of the big three public cloud providers, amongst others, with powerful Nvidia Tesla GPUs, which power a whole host of cloud services that customers can rent on a consumption basis from the likes of Azure, Amazon, Google, which use the capabilities of GPUs that we've already talked about to do really high-end stuff like machine learning training, image recognition, like we've already spoken about, all these kinds of really intense workloads.
I feel like we should point out that actually it's the GPU formerly known as Tesla, and it's been rebranded Nvidia Data Center GPUs, which
is
catchy.
just catchy. It's much more depressing and prosaic. I can understand why they've changed it, but I mean, could they not have come up with something a little more inventive at least?
What I will say is, not naming any names here, but at least it's not just a jumble of letters and numbers.
Well, this is very true.
Check out the new R75Z9. Yeah, so once again, cloud computing, what has been found that is the best use for it is, like I say, larger workloads, more specialized workloads, not necessarily just storing all your data on the cloud, but spinning something up, doing a task, and then spinning it down again.
So you're not going to need a box in your data center that's constantly running machine learning workloads or image recognition or all of this kind of stuff, or simulation models, for example. A lot of the time, that box is just going to be sitting there not doing a huge amount. So rather than having this asset in your infrastructure, which you rarely use, it makes perfect sense to just rent that capacity as and when you need it. And it's Nvidia that powers a lot of the services catering to that cloud providers are offering.
Are you ready for an analogy?
Oh, God. Here we go.
It's like a plane.
Is it?
It's like a plane. Yeah, it's like a plane. Because you could have a private jet, but it will spend most of its time on the tarmac or in a hangar and probably not be as well looked after as a commercial airliner, where, if you've got the money for a private plane, you can probably, pay to fly first class and get a decent experience, and you don't even have the outlay of it.
That's actually not bad.
Yeah, that's why I'm a queen of analogies.
So we should probably talk about ARM and how that fits into all of this.
Yes. One of the most controversial stories and acquisitions of 2020, really. Which
big surprise.
I was going to say, given everything else that's like happening, it's nice to have a standout moment that isn't just, oh my god, everything's on fire. Yeah. However, genuine concerns have been voiced about it now. Of course, a British processor company based in Cambridge, and
one of the few remaining British tech giants, it should be noted.
The reason I'm making a noise like a squeaking door is because, yes, but they were acquired by SoftBank a while ago, so they haven't been British owned for some years. So yeah, it is a controversial acquisition, I think, for a few reasons. First of all, I think there are a lot of people who don't realise that Nvidia was already owned by SoftBank, which is a Japanese company, rather than being a British company, and British owned. I think there is some concern about sort of monopoly type issues, really, that it's going to make Nvidia too big in too many areas, too dominant rather, in both.
Because ARM is everywhere.
Yes,
ARM is in a huge amount of devices, including soon Macs.
Yes, and I think there has been some concern over whether Nvidia might cut off access to ARM's sort of architecture and just ARM in general. So we'll have to see how that plays out in reality, as with so many things. And when it comes to the reason why, though, it's very much to enhance Nvidia's AI play. This was made plain by Jensen Huang at ARM's most recent conference, saying that they want to create the computing company for the age of AI, and also cognizant of the barrier that is represented by Moore's law. We're starting to theoretically come to the end of Moore's law, and there's a question of what we do beyond that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting watching how Nvidia integrates ARM and vice versa over the next couple of years. Nvidia's been doing some really interesting stuff in the areas of kind of AI and 5G, as we've spoken about, and it's making more and more of those kind of research-led technologies available on a consumer basis now. As we mentioned, it's doing more in the cloud, kind of commoditizing those technologies and those capabilities for easy consumption by customers who don't have necessarily a huge kind of AI development wing or, any particular expertise in developing these kind of technologies from the ground up. So potentially integrating some of ARM's capabilities into that is, I think, very interesting from a cloud perspective and could potentially open up a whole host of really bleeding edge technologies to, customers on a much more, I guess, democratized basis, to bring it back to the election.
My overall feeling as well is that it's going to be a positive development rather than a negative one. I'm sure that some of our listeners, if you disagree, listeners, do contact us. We are podcast@itpro.co.uk. But yeah, that's my feeling on it. Or certainly it's not going to be, the devastating development that some people have been predicting.
So Nvidia continues to grab headlines for the generational advancements made in its GPU range, most recently with the RTX 3080 series, which, as a sidebar, the RTX 3080 was launched about a month after I built my gaming PC, as fans of the podcast will remember, and I could have kicked myself when they launched it, because I just could have waited and got my hands on one rather than the 2080 Ti, which I went for in the end. But time makes fools of us all.
Well, I was going to say patience is a virtue, so
a virtue which I do not possess.
Yes, this is true. But yeah, once again, aside from, it's still a massively important player in the graphics, the consumer graphics field. Really, where it's making its most significant impact in a more kind of global way is in AI and high performance computing.
In a lot of ways, it's the gaming that feeds the high performance computing and AI research rather than the other way around, which I think I probably assumed when I first started, as a tech journalist and as a tech enthusiast. I kind of assumed that, all of the AI stuff that Nvidia was doing was a more recent attempt to bolster its business and to diversify what it was doing, when in actual fact they've always coexisted, and in many ways it's the AI and the research that is the more important side of the business.
Yeah, and that's at the end of the day, most of us come into contact with most things as consumers. And yeah, if you are busy delving behind the scenes as we are, then you will be more knowledgeable about the other applications and, through research and writing about how long companies have been involved in other areas. But, as a general consumer, you're not necessarily going to know, really. And I would be interested to know, like, kind of how much interplay there is there as well. One of the first games that I played on the PC was Batman Arkham Asylum that used Nvidia graphics, and there was an update afterwards that kind of put in stuff like leaves that would move around as you moved through and more realistic water and that kind of thing. So I wonder, because that kind of thing is fluid dynamics, or just dynamics of how things move around, physics. Indeed, that's what it's called, physics. And I'd be interested to know kind of like which one feeds into what and how much interplay there is there.
Well, one of the big kind of selling points of the most recent RTX range is the real-time ray tracing that it's capable of. And that is something that has kind of a big foot, if you like, in the area of kind of floating point calculations and the parallel processing that we were talking about earlier. It's the kind of the hard, really advanced maths calculations that the research side has been working towards for things like scientific modeling, that has allowed that technology to be brought forward into kind of consumer level games applications.
So when are we likely to see Jensen get another freshly baked GPU out of his oven?
Well, Nvidia has a bit longer of a release cadence than, a company like Apple, for example. So we're probably not likely to see any major generational updates next year. Jensen probably isn't going to be pulling the 4080 series out of the oven anytime soon. But I would suggest, especially with the, research and development might of ARM augmenting it, I think we could well see something new by 2022 or possibly 2023. But whatever we see next, it is almost certainly going to be very impressive indeed.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time for this week's episode. Do let us know what you thought, though. Would you like to hear more episodes like this? Or are there any other companies that you'd like us to talk about next? Hit us up on social media or email podcast@itpro.co.uk.
You can also subscribe to the ITPro newsletter for more great content every day, or follow our YouTube channel.
We'll be back next week for more IT insights, but until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.